Stay where you are and then leave. Chapter 14, the last chapter. And I've not read this, so this is the first time I've read this. Chapter 14, take me back to dear old Blighty. Kalina Janacek looked into the front parlour of her home at number 6 Damley Road and found her father sitting in an armchair with a newspaper open on the floor beneath him. On his left sat an open shoeshine box made of dark brown mahogany wood, twice as long as it was wide, with a gold-coloured clasp to unlock the lid from the base. Carved into the side was the word Holzknecht, and an emblem that displayed an eagle soaring above a mountain, wild-eyed and dangerous. Mr. Janacek was shining his shoes. "Do you have the present?" she asked, and her father nodded, pointing towards the table where a copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens sat. It was July 1922, almost 4 years since the end of the war, and Alfie Summerfield was having a 13th birthday party. "We should go," said Mr. Janacek, putting his shoes on and standing up. He reached for his cane, the one that he'd brought when he first came back from the Isle of Man, the same one that helped him make his way from number 6 to the sweet shop and back again. His leg had been fine before he left, of course. This was something that had happened to him inside the camp. "Should we tell the man just today or wait?" he asked. "Should we tell the man just today or wait?" "Not today," said Kalina, shaking her head. "Let's wait until after Alfie's birthday. We'll tell them tomorrow." "All right. I should take the sign down though, I suppose," he said as they left the house. He looked down the street towards the sweet shop, which had had a for sale sign on it ever since he and his daughter had been dispatched back to London like redirected post in 1919. The neighbours all thought it was for show, that the Janaceks would never leave, but they'd agreed between them that once the internment was over, they would leave England forever and never return. It had just taken this long to sell the shop. "When will we go anyway?" asked Kalina. "It will take a couple of weeks for the legal work to be completed. All being well, we should be back in Prague by the end of the month, and that day can't come soon enough as far as I'm concerned." "Won't you miss London at all?" she asked, linking arms with him, and he shook his head. "Why should I miss it?" he asked. "It is not home. It was never home. I thought it was, but I was wrong. If I never see England again, it will be too soon. You feel the same way, don't you?" Kalina hesitated. She wanted to leave, of course. She'd been born in this country and then been treated like an outsider, and she could not forgive them for that. But she remembered that she had been happy before the war, that she had had many friends, the best one of all being Alfie. "Can you believe that it was 8 years ago today that we stood inside this house and lamented the outbreak of the war?" asked Mr. Janacek, knocking on the Summerfield's front door. "And yet it feels like 100 years ago, don't you agree? Nothing now is as it was. Nothing now is as it was. Everything seems like an illusion to me. I did nothing wrong, and these people have destroyed me. No, we will go back to Prague, you and I. We will be safe there." Granny Summerfield stood in the kitchen of number 11 and pressed her finger against the top of the sponge cake that she'd baked that morning. It was cool to the touch. She opened the fridge and took out the icing that she'd made earlier. Flour, sugar, milk, cream. It still felt strange to her to have such ready access to these things again after so many years of being unable to find them. Not that they were readily available, of course. You had to know where to go, and you had to keep in with some of the shopkeepers. But still, things were much better than they had been during the war. Things were getting back to normal, and everyone said that this was the war to end all wars. They would never see its like again. She'd always enjoyed baking, and one of the greatest hardships for her during those years had been her inability to prepare her favourite food and share it with the people she loved. She remembered when she was a girl and had first learned how to cook. Oh, what an adventure it had seemed. Now, of course, she did more cooking than she ever had before, even though she was getting on a bit. Margie didn't have much time on her hands, what with all the changes that had taken place across the road at number 12, but she didn't mind. She liked to help out. She sat down, sure that she had everything ready for the party later, and settled into her armchair for 40 winks, just as old Bill Hemperton across the road struck up his gramophone and the first melancholy strings of a new record he'd bought began to play across the street. In the old days, of course, Granny Summerfield would have been across the road like a shot, banging on his door and telling him to turn that racket down. But she didn't do that anymore. Life was too short. And besides, she quite liked this song. Margie checked her watch and gasped a little under her breath. She'd been hoping to finish at the hospital at lunchtime in order to get everything ready for Alfie's party. And here it was, almost 1 o'clock already, and no sign of her leaving. "Nurse Summerfield!" She turned round and saw a matron walking towards her, her arms swishing back and forth as she strode along. "Yes, matron. I know you wanted to go home early today, but I wondered if you might like to be able to stay a little longer." Margie shook her head. "I can't. I would if I could, but it's my son's birthday. I promised I'd be home." "Oh, of course, said matron, a frown crossing her face. "I wouldn't ask, only—" Margie sighed. She'd been working at the hospital for 5 years now, and sometimes couldn't quite believe that she'd never left after the war. But then, she'd never thought about leaving. She found the work interesting, and she liked helping people. And things were different now anyway. It wasn't like the old days when a married woman going out to work would have been frowned upon. Things were starting to change for the better. "What's happened?" she asked. "It's just a young man who's been brought in," explained matron. "He's in a bad way, poor fellow. He must have taken a notion last night and did something stupid. He'll survive, certainly, but we're just waiting for his parents to get here. I thought maybe you might sit with him for a while." "How old is he?" asked Margie quietly. "About 27, I should think." Margie nodded. She knew what that meant. "Where is he?" "He's in St. Agatha's ward, bed 3. I spoke to his father. He'll be here in half an hour. You can go once he arrives. You don't mind, do you?" Margie smiled and shook her head. "No," she said. "No, I don't mind." She made her way towards St. Agatha's ward and went in. It wasn't difficult to see which bed matron had been referring to. The man was lying on his side, tears streaming down his face. When he saw Margie walking towards him, he pulled his arms out of sight, underneath the blankets, but not before she glimpsed the tight bandages wrapped around his wrists. She pulled a chair over her and glanced up at the name above the bed, Cecil Cratchley, before smiling at him and laying her hand on his shoulder. "Hello, Cecil," she said. The young man blinked a few times but said not a word. "I'm Nurse Summerfield," she continued. "I'm going to sit with you for a little while, if that's all right. I think your parents are coming in to see you. And then we're going to take good care of you, all of us here at the hospital, and your mum and dad, and we're going to sort everything out. And before you know it, you'll be as right as rain again. Do you hear me, Cecil? You're going to be right as rain, and you'll look back on these days in the future and wonder what you were so upset about. Everything, Cecil, is going to be all right." And somehow, the young man seemed to believe her, because he looked up and gave a little smile as he locked eyes with her. And Margie smiled right back. She was good at this. The truth was, she'd finally found something that she was good at. Mr. Asquith trotted happily along Damley Close, his tail swishing sporadically to keep the flies away. He'd never been thrilled about being attached to a milk float, but life was a life, and one did what one had to do to get along. And anyway, at least that clown Henry Lyons had been dispatched elsewhere, and his pal, his true old pal, where had he been, was back at the helm. There were worse ways to make a living, he supposed. The final milk churns were delivered to Damley Close just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and now that the float was empty, Georgie Summerfield began to make the journey back to the dairy, lighting up a cigarette with a half frown on his face. "Do you know," he said, "I'm thinking of giving these things up. They can't be much good for you, can they?" Alfie shrugged. He did a lot of shrugging these days. Margie said it was his age. Georgie didn't mind. He knew that his son was growing older. If that was the worst of it, then they wouldn't have got off too badly. "Do you remember when you used to beg me to let you ride the float with me, son?" he asked, and Alfie smiled, for this was a good memory. "And you never used to let me," he said. "Well, you were too young," said Georgie. "The trouble I would have got into. The dairy would have gone mad if they'd found out, and that's nothing to what your mother would have done." "I didn't dare, Alfie. Didn't have the nerve." Alfie shook his head and looked across at his father. You had nerve, he said quietly. I know that much anyway. Georgie nodded and slowed down as Joe Patience emerged from the library on the right-hand side of the street. He tooted the horn, and Joe looked up in surprise but gave a wave when he saw Georgie and Alfie seated side by side on the milk float. He's doing well for himself these days all the same, isn't he? Said Georgie, waving back. Every bookshop I pass, there's that book of his in the window. Ooh. Every bookshop I pass, there's that book of his in the window. I keep meaning to buy a copy and read it, but I don't think I could concentrate that long. You can borrow my copy if you want, said Alfie. You've read it then? Yes. What's it like? Alfie smiled. Dirty, he said, which made Georgie burst out laughing. Maybe I'll have a read of it after all, he said, shaking his head. Only not a word to your mother, do you hear? What time's it now anyway? Alfie glanced at his watch. Almost 1:30, he said. Perfect, said Georgie. We'll get the float back, give Mr. Asquith a wash down, then be home in time to change before the guests arrive. He whistled through his teeth for a moment. 13 years old, he mused. Makes me feel old, that does. I can't believe how grown up you've become. You're looking forward to your party? Alfie said nothing, and Georgie turned to look at him in surprise. You're not, are you? I can see it in your face. Oh, it's not that, said Alfie. I don't think I really like birthdays, to be honest. What? But everyone likes birthdays. I don't, said Alfie. Makes me think of what it was like to be 5 again, and then what it was like to be 6, 7, 8 and 9. Georgie nodded and steered Mr. Asquith to the left. Those days are all in the past now, son, he said. We have happy times ahead of us. These last few years have been good, haven't they? I know it took me a while to get better. But I'm fine these days, haven't I? I'm sleeping, I'm eating, I'm working. You still have nightmares, said Alfie quietly. But not as many as before. Honestly, Alfie, I'm fine. There's nothing for you to worry about. And look, here we are on a fine summer's day, father and son riding the milk float together like you always wanted. It's not a bad life really, is it? Alfie smiled and shook his head. No, he said. Nah, it's a pretty good life all told. They drove along in silence for a few minutes, and only when the dairy came into sight did Georgie speak again. I don't think I've ever really thanked you, have I, Alfie? For what? For succeeding in your secret mission, said Georgie with a smile. For coming to find me in the hospital. For breaking me out. Oh, it wasn't very sensible when I look back on it, said Alfie. No, but it all came good in the end, and it meant everything to me to see you, to know the lengths you go to in order to get me back home again. That's what kept all of us alive in the trenches, you know. The idea that one day we'd get to go home again and see our wives and our children. You're what kept me alive, even at the lowest points. Alfie turned away and watched as the houses passed by on the left-hand side. He didn't really like to talk about the old days. He was just happy they were behind them all and life had got back to normal. Or a new type of normal, anyway. I never knew what you had in mind, said Georgie. All the trouble you could have got into, all the chances you took, all that hard work with Mr. Janacek's shoeshine box, all the sacrifices you made, taking trains on your own when you'd never been on a train in your life, coming to find me, bringing me home, saving me. I never knew why you thought you should do it all. He turned into the dairy and pulled Mr. Asquith to a halt. It was dark in here, and he turned to look at his son, his Alfie, who was wondering whether he'd get to ride on the float with his dad again the following day. Tell me, son, said Georgie, why did you go to so much trouble? Alfie turned and stared at his father. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. There were so many memories in his head, things that sometimes kept him awake at night, things that sometimes gave him nightmares just like Georgie's. The worry when his dad went missing, the stench of the hospital, the shaking and trembling of the patients, the way they spoke, the nonsense of it. These were things he would never forget, things that would influence the man he would one day become. Why, son? Repeated Georgie. Alfie shook his head and turned away, shrugging his shoulders for the 100th time that day. He couldn't tell his father the reason, not just yet. Maybe when he was older, he'd be able to say the words. He already knew them after all. Mr. Janacek had said them to him a long time ago. He'd done it for the best reason in the world. For love. And that's that. Whoa! Right, okay, so loads of stuff to think about there. The Janaceks look like they're actually well. Yeah, they're alive. Although they've had such a horrible time and been treated so badly. And it said they were in a camp, an internment camp, a concentration camp. I'm not quite sure. I've only just read it, so I've not got my head around it. But they've been treated so badly they want to leave London and go back to Prague. Granny Summerfield seems like she's chilled out quite a bit. Yeah, she's back into baking. She said life was too short. Margie is now a proper nurse and she's good at it. Mr. Asquith's quite happy again. He's got his old pal back. Georgie is finally giving up the ciggies, which he should do because they're terrible, yeah. So I'm glad he said that. And he seems well. He's having nightmares. He's, you know, Alfie seems to be thinking, is he really well? But he seems much better than he did in the previous few chapters. Joe Patience looks like he's actually written a book and he's become an author himself. That's amazing. Although I'm not sure what his book's about. I don't know. I don't know what to say. I'm a bit... What was that bit I read? Page 246. He turned into the dairy and pulled Mr. Asquith to a halt. It was dark in here and he turned to look at his son, his Alfie, who was wondering whether he'd get to ride on the float with his dad again the following day. I'm not... Right, I might have to read that again, but what does that mean? What's happening the following day? What's happening the day after his birthday? Is there something we don't know? And I've also got it in the back of my head that although this seems like a bit of a happy ending, we know it said something about this being the war to end all wars, but we know it wasn't. We know there was World War II. And in a few years' time, when Alfie's older, would Alfie have to go and fight in that war? So is it necessarily a happy ending? I don't know. But anyway, we're done. I'd love to know what you thought about it. So get some reviews written. Send us some videos. Let me know what you think. Yeah, I've thought it's been fantastic and I've enjoyed reading it. I'll see you.